Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us in this webinar on red teaming. It is my pleasure today to host a very distinguished set of panelists to help us understand what on earth is red teaming? Why is everybody talking about it right now? Where is this coming from? And how do you do this well? At the Institute of Global Politics, we are looking into this question because we have a program that explores red teaming, its promises, its methods, and its limits in the context of artificial intelligence. And indeed, in the context of AI and generative AI, the notion of red teaming is ubiquitous. Everybody is talking about red teaming large language models, red teaming new types of AI applications. What we found is a lot of the large AI labs are, of course, doing their own red teaming in-house. They have red teaming teams, but we also have witnessed the emergence of a community of AI red teaming hobbyists and enthusiasts, sort of the grassroots red teaming community. Sometimes they would gather on Discord servers or elsewhere, and together they do community red teaming, or at least this is how they self-define. There is, of course, as we know, a market for AI red teaming now. You can be an AI red teaming vendor. There is red teaming as a service. And that leaves us sort of at a moment where there's been a cycle of hype around red teaming for a minute. A lot of people thought that this was maybe the best path towards accountability in the context of generative AI. You saw this in some regulatory frameworks. In the EU, for instance, we see the practice of red teaming being demanded by some regulatory frameworks that say if you are running a high-risk AI application, we're going to ask you to do red teaming. And after this sort of moment of hype, will red teaming be the silver bullet for AI harms? We, of course, saw a moment of backlash, sometimes led by researchers saying, wait a minute, what are we talking about when we say red teaming? Here, the definitional haze is very large. Are all these people doing the same thing when they are saying that they are red teaming? Are the hobbies doing the same thing than the AI labs? Are each of these different red teaming teams really using the same methods? And what about those red teaming vendors? What is it that they're doing? And so, in order to break through and find a path forward, we thought the right approach would first be to look back and to really bring experts to help us understand what is the history of red teaming, in which other context has it been applied, and what lessons can we draw from the fun, colorful, and rich history of the practice of red teaming. I will first turn to Micah on our panel, who literally wrote the book on red teaming. Micah, thank you for joining us in this webinar. The first question is to you. What is red teaming?
That's a great question. And if you asked a red teamer, they'd tell you multiple different answers because by definition, they don't like to be categorized and put into boxes. But I always describe red teaming as a way to change the frame through which groups or individuals make judgments or decisions. Because we all have rigid processes, we have formal frameworks, we have systems, we have rules, we have norms, we have habits. In the absence of them, you kind of couldn't get through your day. So these are very helpful. They prescribe our lives and they simplify large organizational practices. The problem is these give you the illusion of rigor because you go through these steps, all these evaluative checks, you go through all of these gates to test either a system or idea or a process or plan or strategy. And inevitably, the individuals doing that are deeply invested in the outcome. So they can't see downsides and they won't identify risk because they put, unless you're a saboteur, you don't work on a strategy or plan with the goal of it failing. You work on it because you want it to be successful and it's part of your career path and it's a big part of who you are. So you have to change the frame to overcome some of these processes, these frameworks, these norms, these habits. And you can do that either through, in the intelligence community, what they call structured analytical techniques or alternative analysis. There's lots of third-party, either group facilitation or pressure testing. There's obviously the whole world of ethical hacking, which is you have a system that is intended to do something. And by design, what a hacker does is make a system do something that is not what it's intended to do, right? In order to reveal vulnerabilities. And all red teaming has really one outcome, which is how do we uncover otherwise hidden risks and vulnerabilities that the individuals responsible for creating, again, a strategy, a process, a product, they themselves cannot find. So the concept, dates back to elements of wargaming in military history, and then red teaming itself really emerges in the 1960s in the McNamara Pentagon, when people are starting to use red to describe the Soviet Red Army, and red then becomes synonymous with any adversary. And then over time, red teaming becomes synonymous with either pressure testing or evaluating or putting independent or alternative critical judgment against an idea, either a mainstream idea or in the intelligence community called mainline analysis. How do you see things differently by employing some of this mindset and some of these very specific techniques?
So, Micah, I think what I'm hearing from you is that definitional haze that we talked about is a little bit by design in the history of red teaming.
Yes.
Yeah, and the thing that sort of is the highest level idea remains to think like an adversary, right? To sort
Either
of
think
espouse the mindset of an adversary, or would you say that this isn't even the through line?
it's either think like an adversary or somebody who has a disinterested outcome in what occurs, because but somebody who develops a plan, process, strategy, or product are it's like asking me how smart or handsome I am. You shouldn't believe what I tell you because I have a vested interest in being deceitful. I have an invested interest in telling you a positive story and a positive outcome. And having that alternative, independent, or adversarial perspective is what really helps uncover, again, those otherwise hidden risks and challenge assumptions that you cannot do on your own. We all have blind spots. And we all like to think that if we think really hard and we have lots of whiteboards around us, like you see behind me, and we make a big pot of coffee, we can find those blind spots. And the truth of the matter is, we know from all history that individuals have them, and organizations, because of the cultural and organizational structures around hierarchy and groupthink, make it even harder for large organizations to uncover those blind spots. So a red teamer is somebody who is looking for things that either an individual or a group by design cannot either think about or talk about.
Tim, I see you nodding, and I think this is where we turn to you for our historian's perspective on that moment that Micah was talking about, where red teaming is really borrowed from both military and intelligence theories. Tell us a little bit about how that concept unfolds in that history.
Well, I was nodding when Micah was talking about how resistant institutions are to competitive analysis
Mm.
because they're hierarchical and because they are mission driven. The emergence of red teaming occurs because of the Cold War, and the term red, as Micah mentioned, comes from the Soviets. And the need for a red team initially was to try to anticipate the way in which the Soviets would react in a war game. Um, uh, because the United States in the 1950s had to contemplate the possibility of at least conventional war in Europe, but possibly nuclear war in Europe once the Soviets developed nuclear weapons in 1949. There was pressure on American analysts and military leaders to think through how a nuclear war, should it arise, would happen, and how, if you can't stop it, you can at least minimize the damage and theoretically win it. And so the red team was the team that was supposed to play the role of the Soviets. That's interesting. But what's much more interesting is that this emerges out of a very interesting intellectual struggle, which exists to this day among social scientists about figuring out the human factor. That's really what makes this so interesting, because the place where the sort of the birthplace of modern red teaming is the Rand Corporation, which still exists in Santa Monica. Rand was established by the Air Force after World War II to assist the Air Force in making procurement decisions. How do we build a better Air Force and one that meets the Soviet threat? and then RAND would acquire its own autonomy and begin to ask other questions. But who was answering these questions? It was a new generation of social scientists, largely led by economists, but not solely by economists, who believed you could create a systematic understanding of human behavior in a military context. And that's where we get the systems analysis that Michael referred to in the McNamara era. McNamara was President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense. When he imports, because he himself is like-minded, he imports people who think this way into the Department of Defense. Some of the red teaming wasn't simply adversarial analysis because we needed somebody to think like the Soviets. It was also a group of dissidents who said, wait a second, these economists think as if every human being will act the same way under certain circumstances, that they're all seeking marginal utility, that the economist has come up with the human rational actor model and everybody is going to act that way. And they said, why? History is replete with examples of people choosing suboptimal strategies. And if we think through a future war scenario and we assume that the Soviets are going to act the way we are, we may miss the actual outcome. We may actually not be able to predict what will occur, and we won't be preparing our military leaders for the kinds of decisions they will face. So red teaming wasn't simply trying to think through Soviet strategic culture. It was also a way for historians and political scientists who are less theoretical but more empirical to test these assumptions that the rational choice people were making of future Soviet behavior in a war context. So that part of the story, the Cold War part of the story, is less interesting, although if we do talk about Ukraine, the red team model is important to understand, I think, the Kremlin. But it's this debate over the human factor, or what other people call soft data. Look, I'm a historian by training, so I'm totally used to all these smears. Okay, that what we do is we study epiphenomenal events, in other words, one-offs. That we take eccentric paths, we're path-dependent students of the world. We ask questions which are totally fallible because they're by humans, and we end up generating outcomes that are useful maybe for one event. I'm used to that. But what's interesting about what historians do is we actually study human beings and we try to understand their individual motivations. Now, this is very tiring if you want to study a government. It's much more fun and easier to create a systematic view of that government rather than figuring out who's in charge, who has the power, who matters. Let me give you two examples of why this could matter. Japan, 1941. The United States intelligence community had to make a resource decision. The resource decision was which high-level Japanese communications traffic should the United States attack. The Army and the Navy had succeeded in attacking the Japanese diplomatic messages. The United States had a history of doing really well spying on the Japanese in negotiations. This is in the 20s. So there was a hidden institutional bias for attacking the diplomatic ciphers of the Japanese. And the United States, the Army and the Navy, independently, because we have bureaucratic competition, and as we do now, independently broke the Japanese diplomatic cipher. And they were excited about it, and they broke it so well that there were moments when there would be circulating in the White House, he deciphered Japanese diplomatic message before the Japanese ambassador had received it and was able to have it deciphered by one of his clerks. That's great. So what's the problem here? The problem was there was no competitive analysis at the time of Japan. Area specialists in Japan, of which there weren't that many in the United States, nobody asked them, if you were going to break one transmission, would it be the diplomatic transmission of Japan? Any Japanese scholar would have said, no. the Japanese foreign ministry knows nothing. The Japanese government is a military dictatorship, and the military does not share its secrets with the diplomats. The last people who will know if there's going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor are the diplomats. You have to break one of their military systems. But there was no competitive analysis in the FDR administration. And the Army and the Navy were so excited about what they were able to break into that they never asked themselves, well, maybe we're actually wasting our resources. We should be focused in the case of the Navy on the naval cipher. So
And this is a great example, and I want to bring Jen in because I think what you're doing here is to encourage us to consider the organizational history of red teaming too. And Jen, you've played a prominent role in bringing some of these practices inside Silicon Valley giants, and it looks to me like maybe some of what Tim is describing, people who feel like they have a great handle on human behavior and who might be a little bit myopic about the signals that they have and might in fact need to broaden their thinking to consider different types of scenario and go chase their own blind spot applies particularly well to some of those large tech companies. Talk to us a little bit about importing these red teaming practices in the context of cyber threat intelligence for Silicon Valley, trust and safety, and then now soon AI.
Yeah. So hi everyone. This is such a delightful conversation so far. So yeah, I think one of the things that I did in Silicon Valley was build threat intelligence teams to do a lot of what Tim and Micah mentioned in terms of thinking through who could break into systems, whether the systems are corporate environments, housing data, or who could go after users in certain situations, or who could misuse platforms to achieve some sort of strategic goal, right? So we had we grew a trust and safety team and intelligence function that got very good at looking around corners and anticipating risk. And I think while we were very good at what we did, we also bumped up against some of the structural realities that Tim and Micah have talked about with regard to one, the sort of prominent perspectives on risk and sort of who gets to define that, right? And it typically who gets to define what matters as a risk is not necessary.
Are you saying that Tim's economists are your tech bros? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, yeah, I mean the sort of fetishization of scale and thinking that we can model our way out of all problems, and the sort of hubris around that, I think is something that persists. And just to kind of, before I talk a little bit more about sort of this in Silicon Valley context, I went down a RAND rabbit hole and was really shocked at the similarities in the discussions that persist when you have these sort of like folks in power who are empowered to sort of dictate the systems and structures of how analysis should happen, and which voices get amplified and why, and which voices do not, and how that manifests later today. So in the RAND context, sort of when teams were doing war games, and you had this sort of mathematical division that was, again, sort of the ilk of the McNamara whiz kids who are like, we can just, model our way out of human behavior. We can sort of take, we think scale is important because we were successful at Ford Motors. And so we can also be successful at, anticipating and sort of defining what potential outcomes could be based on our algorithmic assumptions, right? And what happened, as we discussed, is this sort of denigration and sidelining of different perspectives when it comes to essentially defining existential risk. And I think another important part of this that actually I think resonates with Silicon Valley today is the language used, and the sort of approaches used. And this is where I rediscovered a lot of some reading I did by Carol Cohn in both college and grad school around sort of techno-strategic language and the sanitization of concepts of harm, right? When the way that some of these RAND war games played out and the languages they would use around sort of nuclear weapons, like they weren't using language that really reflected what could happen if nuclear weapons were deployed, right? It was this sort of sanitized unemotional, rational, sterile approach, right? Which has implications for how people analyze things. And and a lot of, there were these sort of snarky comments in a lot of the RAND reports around how unscientific and sort of frivolous some of the other approaches were, right? Because they didn't adhere to this model that like everything can be um, mathematically sort of determined. Now, what does that mean for like what's happening in Silicon Valley and intelligence? Is the same exact discussions played out, right? It's like when I was working in threat intelligence and then built a red teaming program at Niantic where we worked together. The same discussions around sort of like how do you quantify likelihood of certain things happening or not? How do you communicate uncertainty, and like what are the infrastructure realities like that allow some people to be heard and listened to and make decisions? So I think red teaming is both a method and sort of, as Micah and Tim have talked about, a mindset. And I think one of the things that was useful in Silicon Valley that I worked on, and this is what was at Niantic, was designing red teaming exercises as a way to teach other people how to think critically, right? So the outcome itself of the red team was not necessarily actually the most important thing. I mean, of course, when we can get into this, like what makes an effective red teaming or like what are the ingredients for success. But I think an underexplored aspect of this is how do you teach people to think about what could go wrong? And how do you normalize that thinking, right? Like, does your organization have notions of psychological safety? And this gets to what Micah was talking about, I think, with like institutional capture and like people not wanting to hear things. There's also, so, as you know, we sort of designed kind of like communal red teams where we had folks from different parts of the org, who lived in different places of the world, came from different lived experiences, sort of banging around on a product or feature to provide input. And of course, some of the messaging back is like, well, this isn't repeatable. This isn't scientific. This isn't, something that we can easily metricize. And those ingredients typically of like standardization, repeatability are the things that I think Micah used the phrase illusion of rigor. Those are things that also tend to be more accepted in organizations, right? Like leadership is like, I don't know what to do with a bunch of random insights. How do we make this more sustainable? So I feel like I'm a little bit all over the place, but I think
No, I think, Jen, what you're sharing is that this red teaming practice, which comes from the Cold War, comes from our desire to war game, and with the sort of rich institutional history that Tim highlighted, which is you call the red team because everybody else is focused on, their own myopic, I have an information on this and I will follow that. To Micah's point, like you're also calling the red team because you may have blind spots and you may need to do something slightly different. I think we're also hearing that, again, the definitional haze is a little bit by design, and that found its resonance in Silicon Valley and in that context. You asked, what can we learn from that history on how to make these sets of exercises successful? What is a good red team? What does a good red team look like? Mike, I want to turn to you as somebody who probably helped a few organizations think through that question. What are the ingredients of a good red team given that context?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to immerse yourselves almost as a sociologist or a behavioralist to really understand the pressures and the dynamics that happen in any organization. One of the things that Jen's hinting at is that organizations have, at the most senior levels, have tremendous misalignment around risk tolerance. If you talk to some leaders, they say, we want people taking risks at the front lines. We want to be innovative and creative. Then you talk to the general counsel and they say, like, that's absolutely not what we're doing here. And they talk to the CFO and they say something different. So organizations create an enterprise risk system, which all looks the same. There's quarterly reporting. There's a risk audit committee on a board. They do red, yellow, green tracking of material business risks. They have to report them annually to the SEC. And it's all a check the box exercise. Is to do the minimum appearance of due diligence that you have thought about risks to invested money. That's the primary thing, is what poses a risk to invested money and can report to the SEC. And you can go look at any company's annual report, and the material business risks are quite long. But are they really actioning those? And does the leadership really understand which of those pose an acute risk to customer or user experience, to workforce, to environmental, social, cultural, local neighborhood experiences, you know? And so like all those lenses are generally not appreciated. So once you understand an organization, then you can start to think about what are the sort of activities that will help them change the frame through which they elevate certain risks over others, and they have real, honest, ground truth conversations between individuals that are assisted by data and assisted by expertise about what they're going to do about it and whether it really matters. Because the most prevalent issue I see in most organizations is that experts exist on islands of authority. And if you work in legal, you're on an island. And if I work in product, I'm on an island. And if you work in sales, you're on an island. And we have a tacit understanding that I will not come onto your island and you will not come onto my island, because I am immersed to the ground level as an SME, and I know everything about my thing, and you don't know anything about my thing, nor do I know about yours. So the degree of misalignment is so prevalent that only a red team who thinks either adversarial or thinks from an alternative lens can sort of uncover some of those things. So I can talk more about what comprises a good red team, but that's some of the dynamics that a red team has to exist in and think about.
Yeah, like I think what I'm hearing from all of you is something that maybe we lost as we translated this concept from, intelligence studies to general business risks to cyber to safety and now to AI, is this notion that what is being red team is the organization itself, right? When we think about AI, we red team the model, the product, right? But I think what I'm hearing from the three of you is part of what being his red team is the organization, its assumption, its misalignment at the leadership level. Tim, maybe a few lessons from history on what is the object of the red team when you are designing this process to expose your own blind spots and maybe have a different perspective on what you're looking at.
Well, one of the things that you have to be careful of is structural overcorrection. If you look at the history of intelligence analysis, national security analysis in this country, and in other countries too, but I'll just focus on the United States. When a country is surprised, and you don't have to use the word country, when a company is surprised, it will react dramatically because it can't react just in one small way, because it has noticed a flaw. And so it overcorrects systematically. And so what you see in the history of intelligence is surprise and overcorrection, surprise and overcorrection. You do not see, because of the stickiness of institutions, the nip and tuck. I'm shifting my metaphors from sort of engineering metaphors to basically
Plastic
plastic
surgery.
But what's better is a nip and tuck process that's actually iterative and organic. But you don't get that with institutions because they're so big and complicated, and to shift the system is such a big deal. You just have an after action report following the disaster and then the big change. So what does that mean for the history of intelligence? The United States underestimates the Soviet ability to build a nuclear weapon and then to put it and then to deliver it. And then the United States overestimates the Soviet ability to deliver it. And then the United States, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, seeing how the Soviets had been defeated, and that's a debatable process, but let's just say that was the takeaway. The US then assumed the Soviets would think like us and would not make the same mistake again, and thus was surprised when the Soviets started to build many more strategic weapon systems than they should have been building if they had followed the rules of or the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then the US then overestimated, and then of course was surprised when the Soviet economy collapsed. So just broadly speaking, these institutions of analysis are sticky. And so the process of competitive analysis within those institutions may result in one big systematic shift every half generation, but it's hard to achieve. And that means that you might effectively, one of the consequences of competitive analysis is to prepare for the next surprise, to actually put the whole institution on the road to having corrected the last war, but not predicting the next one, if you understand. And so that's why this process of competitive analysis should be ongoing. It should be routinized. But that's really hard, as Micah explained, and Jen also talked about, given the risk profiles of particularly publicly traded companies, this kind of analysis is hard to sustain. And in the US government, it's extremely difficult, not in the CIA. Micah has written about Red Cell, but it's hard at higher levels. I'll give you an example. Ukraine. I don't know if the Biden administration had a red team thinking about Putin's willingness to use nuclear weapons, but it should have. Nevertheless, the risk tolerance of the president was likely not one that would permit a test of escalation. The kind of test of escalation that would have been necessary to prove, by the way, what I assumed, which was that Putin was following the Soviet tradition of scaring us, of actually bluffing, because that was the strategic culture, as we learned from Soviet records years later. Their strategic culture was to scare us. And Putin is a creature of that. Now, that's very soft analysis. That I don't have the proof of it, but that's my governing assumption, knowing the history of Soviet strategic culture. These people bluff. But does a president of the United States want to take that chance? And that's where there are limits, at least in the strategic context, of risk tolerance and limits of the effectiveness of competitive analysis. There may be a point that the analysts want to take you, but the leaders can't go.
Tim, that's very helpful. And it sort of helps us understand why that red teaming practice kind of resists its formalization into an exercise that would be highly repeatable for Silicon Valley, that could be designed and done over and over again to secure launches, which is kind of like where that trend is going. Micah, I suppose this is not the first time in the history of red teaming that there's a moment where people are saying, well, that's a great idea. Why don't we do this? Why don't we just write the red teaming playbook and we will do this once a month and it will secure everything everywhere all the time and it will be great. Talk to us about precedents there and maybe what we can learn from those.
Yeah, and to Tim's point, a lot of this comes up after an event. So the after 9/11, 3 days after that, the CIA creates a red cell. After the misunderstanding about Iraqi WMD capability, the CIA and the intelligence community comes up with the mandated structural analytical techniques or alternative analysis. Also, in response to the inability to foresee the Sunni insurgency in Iraq, the U.S. Army creates a Red Team University at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which itself no longer exists anymore. So there has to be an event which compels people to realize that we missed something. The system missed either data or did not allow for data that existed to emerge to decision makers. And it's not surprising that given the uncertainty around AI, both as a capability and how it will develop, that people are turning to red teaming. Because just as you would for, as I always say, the noun doesn't matter, right? So red teaming is applicable to, it's really kind of agnostic on what it can be applied to. If you have something that is defined and is part of an organization, it can be, as a verb, red teamed, because it exists within all the dynamics, the culture, the pressure, the organizational norms that any system exists. So people are turning to red teaming, one, because it sounds cool and it's different than pressure testing or evaluation or some critical gate or framework. And so, but I always say, unless you know what the red teaming consists of, unless you know the individuals, what their incentives are, what activities they're actually doing, are they actually going to the true center of gravity of what red teaming could do? Are they trying to uncover the worst possible cases? Or are they giving the illusion of pressure testing? Are they giving the illusion of critical evaluation, independent evaluation, or not? So anytime you see red teaming in the news, I always warn people, don't assume red teaming is being done. It's been called that because someone in an organization decided this is what we should call evaluation or critique or review, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing the work of the really devious adversary, the really independent sort of alternative out-of-the-box thinker within an organization, the true maverick. Unless you know what's actually going on and the product, the output, and how it's being employed to improve a system, a product, a strategy, or whatever, just be careful when you see it mentioned.
Jen, I feel like you've been the maverick that people call in after a difficult strategic surprise in Silicon Valley. One that comes to mind, of course, is the Internet Research Agency, the troll farm that in 2016, helped Silicon Valley confront the blind spot of information operations. You've played a critical role in exposing that, and then that helped after shape what is it that we could do differently to ensure that we don't have constant blind spots. What do you think here can be borrowed from the red team method to help address that cycle that Tim's talking about, from going from strategic surprise to overcorrection and then back and forth again?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to kind of touch on is this notion of surprises, and how, at least in cases I've been involved in, and I'm sure Micah and Tim have historical examples, they're often not entirely surprises. There were people whose jobs it was to analyze this and communicate it. And so the gap was necessarily not that people like had no idea. It was in the communication mechanisms. It was in the sort of, as Micah was talking about before, the sort of like risk tolerance among leaders. It's the organizational wrapper around how this analysis happens. So I think like using the word surprise, particularly when it comes to the use case or the example that you mentioned with the Russian activity on Facebook that some of our teams looked at, we actually did predict that stuff was happening, and then actually not only predicted, but then started to actually see it. And so it wasn't that, again, it wasn't a big surprise to those of us who are steeped in this. It was a surprise to leaders and external folks or whatnot who maybe were caught flat-footed because either the internal systems or internal culture just wasn't hospitable to this type of analysis. And I think this also raises, you mentioned me being a bit of a maverick. I think another sort of interesting angle
In
of
a
this,
good way.
in a good way, 100%. But an interesting angle of this is that like it takes, we talk about like internal red teams and how challenging it could be to sort of properly empower them to really take an outsider's look or an adversarial perspective because of the real reality of institutional capture and their own career trajectories, and how doesn't make you necessarily popular within an enterprise if you're like just listing out issues, right? And this actually goes back to the Rand thing, where a lot of the discussions were like the political scientists and historians and war war people were, and with their lived experience, were, oh my gosh, I totally lost my train of thought where I was going there. Okay, it'll come back to me. But I think another aspect of overcorrection, right? When we see these sort of like big events, and then you see a lot of hiring, a lot of building up of teams, and then you have like almost too much information. Nobody knows how to synthesize it. Nobody knows like what's the real kind of source here. And then you have it swing back. And we saw the same thing happen in Silicon Valley after 2016, 2017. A lot of companies bulked out their threat intelligence risk apparatus. And then, we have all this analysis, right? All these potential surprises, but the digestive mechanisms for kind of bubbling up, and also the inconvenient decisions around how these risks may bump up against, in the private sector context, product growth, things like that, where the rubber meets the road. So I think, again, like the underlying theme that keeps coming up that I think is very important for people to understand is that red teaming as a method cannot be divorced from the institution or structure within it's situated, right? And this gets back to like, how do you design a useful red team? Being able to be very specific about these aspects and having the institutional willingness to act on these things is important. And so when we think about sort of red teaming in the cybersecurity context, right, that's a fairly, I would say, defined practice, right? How it professionalized is that it got more, there's not even light, but consensus on sort of what are the right, methodologies to use. The sort of outcomes are fairly clear, right? Okay, we have these vulnerabilities that we need to patch, right? What gets thornier is the socio-technical aspect of like, how do you deal with, things that maybe can't be easily patched or easily quantified, right? And those again force the hard discussions that often get shunted aside or often maybe are misaligned with what the organization wants to do. And so I think, I think that like, well, I'll stop there, but that's sort of
Then
just the perspective.
I like you taking it back to cyber, where indeed red teaming corresponds to something that is at least understood. There's a consensus on the understanding of like what is red teaming in the context of cyber. I wonder, Micah, this is a weird question, but in a red teaming exercise in the cyber context, we spend a lot of time negotiating what is in and out of scope. Is the idea of anything being out of scope for a red team contrary to the purpose of the red team?
Well, I think, that's the first question. In my book, I have a bunch of best practices of red teaming, and the number one is the boss must buy in, because if senior leadership doesn't want it, sign off on it, resource it, and do something with the findings, sort of nothing else matters. And I always say, like, the worst thing you can do is empower a red team to find risks and vulnerabilities to your software, your system, your plan, your strategy, and then to do nothing with it. Because if you red team and you do nothing with it, it is the worst signal to the organization that this is not a place where challenging, dissenting, and independent viewpoints are welcomed. It's like literally the way that you shut down frontline leaders from feeling empowered and from identifying risks sort of on their own. But the scope issue is really quite critical, because a lot of red teaming is done as a requirement, either of a regulatory process, like in the state of New York, you have to do a cyber war game every year if you're a financial institution. And so they know exactly what that has to look like. They know exactly who to involve in the C-suite and a couple of board members, and they just follow it right to the process. And there's a polite sort of tabletop conversation. It usually lasts 2 to 3 hours, and they're done. And that checks the box, right? So they don't have real honest conversations. They look at again, that red, yellow, green list of material business risks, and they just sort of have a conversation around them, not really thinking about things. But if you want to really understand how your company can be upended, you have to allow generally anything. And that includes, like, as hackers have always said to me, it's like, can I kidnap the CEO? Is it at that level of threat? And what is the inherent center of gravity that you need to go at and to test and to find vulnerabilities around? Because if you don't go at that true center of gravity, people often say, like, well, why we don't really need to keep secrets. There's nothing secret going on here. The point of a really smart social engineer, hacker, and now you can use AI systems like Worm GPT, which tell you what a center of gravity is for an organization. It helps you find it. They will find something so exceptional or embarrassing or reputational harm that they can either release about you or frame you in a way that it will be as harmful as any malicious malware attack or freezing your bank accounts or equivalent. So they will find your center of gravity. So if you don't empower a team ahead of time to try to do that on their own, you are putting yourself needlessly at greater risk. And the only reason you don't empower somebody to do that is you don't want to know. And there are truly some leaders who don't want to know what is the greatest existential risk to their organization. Because if they know and it occurs, they can be sued for having learned of a material business risk and not acting upon it. So they don't even allow it to occur. They keep it narrowly scoped so that can't occur. Or they just don't want to deal with it. Like, there's a lot going on. We're very busy. We have a product launch coming up. Like, we'll do this next year or the year after. So sort of equivalent. So there's the typical sort of, business issues which prevent that from happening. So it's oftentimes that scope issue is so critical, because people are looking to avoid hard conversations about risks that their system is facing.
We're going to turn to Q&A. Micah, what you're describing, I did some interviews with people who did the early red teaming in Silicon Valley, and when they talk about what they did, frankly, it looks more like immersive theater than it looks like a box checking exercise, because they're like, I'm just gonna go very maverick, and it's indeed closer to the let's kidnap the CEO approach than
Can I,
to let's do systematic testing. Tim, before we turn to Q&A, I go ahead.
I just
You know what
wanted to jump. Spoiler alert! I'm not spoiling this for people, but the fifth season of Slow Horses is all about.
Don't tell me, I haven't seen it yet.
No, I just this conversation about thinking about vulnerabilities in a system you will see it discussed, described, and narrated in a fascinating way in season 5.
All
So
right. I love
I
this.
won't, but I will, but it'll get, and then you'll say, oh my goodness, that's what they were talking about in this webinar, although none of us, I believe, participated in shaping the program.
We should
I
have
don't
Gary Oldman come and talk with us because love that show.
So let me just make sure that the audience is empowered to ask anything they want now, truly anything they want in the Q&A, no scope. Uh, and we'll take those questions. But thanks, Tim. I love that. Now we know what to read on the history of red teaming. We went down Micah's great lessons for red teaming. We should read his book. I love that you also referenced some of the 60s writing from the Cold War. It's interesting and fascinating to go back to those original texts. Jen, it sounds like you had a fun time reading some of this original Rand materials too. And now we know what to watch. If you want the TV version of this conversation, apparently the last season of Slow Horses will take us there. With this, let me turn to the audience and make sure we can take some questions. The first one here is how is red teaming? I think Jen, this one's gonna come to you first, and then we'll have Micah and Tim comment on it. How is red teaming evolving to take into account certain AI models' ability to conceal their own intentions? And so this is a question because researchers at Anthropic have written about Claude's own ability to conceal its own intention. Jen, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think as red teaming has sort of evolved in an AI context, particularly with large language models and generative AI, we've initially there were approaches on just like looking at model outputs, right? And now, as folks are thinking more about sort of how do you pressure test the way that models are trained and aligned, this sort of gets into this question of like, if models are trained to act like humans and designed to keep people engaged, how to interrogate that, which also like the design and the engagement sort of infrastructure is obviously very much tied to the business model, right? But sort of thinking through like, again, with different products who might be trained on sort of anti-woke stuff, right? Like, or how to sort of like malicious or deceptive internal reasoning. If you have folks who are doing, sophisticated prompt engineering to try and to get at that, I think there is emerging research on that. I think I'm not super familiar with the details on it, but I think it signals or shows an evolution in red teaming beyond this sort of more almost like benchmarking and kind of commoditized approach towards it, and more thinking like, okay, how do we get more creative? So I think it is a normal evolution, and yeah.
Micah, Tim.
I'll just say briefly, to smarter people than me, especially Jen and others have written on this, but go look at the last couple of years of DEF CON and Black Hat. You can find a lot of the videos free on YouTube. Like what is being done in terms of using some of these AI systems, both to deceive them and use them for deceit, are kind of unimaginable. And these are just the ones we know about. These are the sort of white hat who are ethically revealing vulnerabilities before they then go tell these large companies. But what's being done is pretty remarkable. And I just think once you get the human out of the loop and you start to train systems to find to be used in ways alternative to their original purpose. It's just kind of hard to imagine when you don't need a hacker to do hacking.
Tim.
I had the experience of interviewing some of the founders of modern deception from different countries, Soviets, Brits, and others. One of the keys to, I'm sad to say, but one of the keys to successful deception is to build on assumptions that your user already has. It's very hard to shift people's mindsets completely. So what you do is you build on a set of assumptions you think they have, and then you magnify those assumptions that are most useful to whatever outcome you want to generate. That's sort of the basic philosophy of successful strategic deception over time, whether in the military or the intelligence context. I'm not sure how applicable that is to this question of deceiving, but I suspect it's the outcome that affects humans, that our vulnerability to such things still matters.
That's helpful. We have a question here that is asking us to be better at our definition of the colors of the team. We talked about red team. We mentioned the existence of a blue team in the face of the red team. And it's pointed that often we talk about purple teams. And even in the context of AI, there's been papers on rainbow teaming. Tim, let me come to you first.
Well,
How much of that is original concepts? How much of that is sort of like things that have
it shouldn't matter what the color of the team is.
Okay.
The issue is Micah listed all the objectives. Either it's stress testing, competitive advantage, competitive analysis, adversarial analysis, thinking outside the box, whatever it is, however you'd like to describe it. It's the same goal: to encourage analytical thinking and hard outside the box analytical thinking. So,
Micah, sorry, go ahead,
so
Tim.
I was just going to say that the term red teaming is an artifact of the origins of this approach, and it's because of the Soviet Union. But it doesn't matter what color you assign to it, as long as you maintain the process.
Micah, does that resonate? Because in cyber, for instance, we care quite a bit about the blue team and the red team, and they do feel different.
They do. And one other thing I would just say, though, is that most people, and my recommendation is nobody should be a red teamer forever. By design, if you are just being the adversarial independent maverick consistently all the time throughout an organization, you can sort of lose touch with the operational realities of people who work inside of an organization. So in the cyber world, most people who do red teaming then go back on blue at a more senior level. And then maybe later in a career, they go back to a sort of more red position. So there's both a career development aspect to this, but to Tim's point, the outcomes are pretty consistent, which are, how do you improve a system? How do you find risks and vulnerabilities that you otherwise couldn't find?
And Micah, just define blue team in this context so that everybody follows along.
Blue team is the people who are designed to keep a system safe, right? So they're the IT team, they're the CISO, the CIO, and all the equivalent digital enterprise folks who maintain the integrity of an allegedly defended system. And the red team are the people who think, how do I disrupt what the blue team's doing?
Jen.
I just want to weigh in a little bit on sort of Micah mentioning, people not necessarily benefiting from being in a red teaming position long term. I think in a Silicon Valley context, in AI, as particularly the big labs have the resources, they have their own internal teams, they have external teams, they have manual approaches where they bring in humans to try and use their expertise. But they also outsource a lot of this work, right? And sort of other people have written on this, but the parallels with content moderation, right, where you sort of like start to abstract the labor of the people that are doing this and thinking about it. Maybe gets sort of people who are paid less. It gets less valued by the organization, right? And that can be that can also have implications for how seriously the findings are taken, right? When you have people who are taken out of an organization, or maybe they're contractors in different parts of the world who are not paid well. Oftentimes, if they're finding things, perhaps their perspectives are, well, not perhaps, we know their perspectives are not taken as seriously, or can be dismissed if they're not, if they're not engineers or they're not integrated into organization. I think there's also very real challenges with with red teamers who are constantly trying to think about worst case scenarios. Like there's, that's, if you're a manager and you're managing these people, like that can lead to burnout, things like that. And these sort of like labor aspects of like who's doing the work of thinking about worst case scenarios, and then they're not being listened to, and then they're not being promoted, that doesn't make it a very attractive sort of situation. So that's, I think, a dynamic we should be mindful of. And I don't know if that is similar in the Intel community, but I know it's that way in Silicon Valley.
So that goes to one of our audience questions, which is, well, obviously the right way to handle this is to have the AI do the red team. And we've talked a lot about red teaming AI systems. How do you all feel about the ability for analysts to use AI in order to assist with some of the red teaming process? Is that the wrong route? Are you worried about people starting to do this and relying on AI insights as they go through this scenario planning and these risk assessment? And has that come up yet in your work? Tim, let's start with you.
Look, you should, as an analyst, you should be open to other perspectives. If AI raises questions you haven't asked, great. If you use AI in a lazy way so that you don't have to ask questions, not so good. One thing I want to put on the table here is that those who read Tom Clancy novels, one of the dangers is you're looking for a Jack Ryan. You're looking for the person who gets it right, who connects the dots in the right way. When in fact, competitive analysis is best when it's an iterative and collective process of many people. So think intellectually of AI as being one person at the table, but there have to be other disciplines and ideas and backgrounds at the table too to get the most fruitful adversarial or competitive analysis.
That's helpful. Micah.
I have a saying, which is that thinking like an adversary or a competitor, it's sort of everyone's responsibility, but it's nobody's job. And in most organizations, there is a competitive intelligence person. They, read studies, they go to conferences, they sort of gather insights among competitors. But does anyone really ever do anything with it, right? That's the question. I think what AI can do is some of those labor-intensive human tasks to find out adversarial perspectives, and just try it. Like you can put your strategy in a paragraph in any AI system and say, take a devil's advocate approach to it. And it will produce a tidy list of 7 to 8 things that most of which are pretty obvious and you would have thought of, but there might be 1 or 2 wrinkles that you hadn't got to. So being open to that capability is useful, but applied critical thinking is I would say a lifelong muscle that atrophies very easily. If you are not thinking, if you're not really doing effortful cognition and thinking differently consistently, you lose the ability to do it pretty quickly.
Jen, you get the final word. I know you and I have the great pleasure of teaching red teaming to our students, something we're about to do again. Do we still have to do this, or is AI going to do it for us?
No, I think AI can do some things for us, but as both Micah and Tim have said, I think we're always going to need humans. I don't think that a large language model is an appropriate sort of constitution of expertise when thinking about this in full. And it's good for maybe, benchmarking and standard approaches, but humans with lived experience and expertise should always be involved. Yeah.
Thank you to the 3 of you. We are at time. You've been very generous with your insights. I think we are learning that there's a rich and colorful history of red teaming that helps explain why it cannot be the tick the box practice that some people hope it can turn into, but why it's a really interesting toolkit to think strategically about blind spots if organizations are truly committed to opening themselves up to this type of scrutiny and to doing something with the insights. Thank you for sharing all these insights. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all the reading and watching recommendations. We are going to continue this programmatic work on the past, present, and future of red teaming, and we look forward to other conversations about it.
Thank you, Camille.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.